Today's video is a little bit different than my normal fare. Today I had a chance to sit down with Rachelle Cooper. She's a colleague and a friend of mine, but she also just finished with her MFA and is having a show this summer that is beautiful. And I wanted to really talk to her about her work and share that with you. Hopefully this will be a new video in a new series of interviews that I do with other artists. So if you're interested or you have a little bit of time, stick around with me and I will introduce you to my very talented friend, Rachelle.
My name's Rachelle Cooper. I just graduated from Idaho State University with my master's in fine art. This is my senior exhibit called Grounded. Well, I went to school in high school basically in order to play sports, and so I kind of, my whole life was about sports, and I played volleyball when I went to college the first time, and I got an injury and wasn't able to do that anymore, perform physically the way I was used to, and it was hard on me, and so I looked for other things that were fulfilling, and I ended up doing construction and kind of working with my hands. I think that's the main thing that made me go back to art, because as a child, of course, I liked to draw, and then that kind of gave way to athletics. And then as I got older, when that option was gone, I started working with my hands and started doing construction of all things. And with that, I would encounter a ton of scraps and waste, and I used that to start making art with. And I realized I had this untapped inspiration and creativity that I never explored. It stems from like manual labor. You know what I mean? My artwork does. Mm-hmm. It does. And it's very clear because this is a lot of work. Yeah, so there's different parts of this. The paintings, those started in my first year. So our program's 3 years here, and you can take a plethora of different classes in the beginning to kind of explore, but what I did is I took painting, and I was familiar with painting, and I painted these really terrible paintings, and I had them, and I used them for my first year review, and I took them to a gallery that summer, and I basically just traveled with them because they didn't sell or anything like that, and they were 4 feet, and so they just kind of sat in the back of my studio for a long time until I looked at them and I was like, how wasteful is that? And they're so big, and so I cut them up and I started working on them again. And so that's what happened with my paintings, is that I would go through this process of kind of reimagining them, resizing them, and then I would look at them again and do it again, but the content of the image never really changed. It just got more in depth, and what I realized what I was doing is kind of exploring space on a two-dimensional surface with them. And so that was a combination of 3 years, but of working on those paintings in my spare time from teaching and doing my schoolwork. And so I didn't really consider it my thesis work until I realized at the end that is in fact my process, and my thesis work was really getting used to my process, like we've talked about before. And so that was the paintings, and then I also taught fibers in the fall of my final year in grad school, and we worked with natural dyes, and so I started learning how to do eco prints on fabric, and I translated that onto paper. And so the other two-dimensional work you see in the exhibit is from eco prints, and it's basically making an impression of natural material onto paper using a mordant like an iron and vinegar solution and steam. And then I use those to draw on top of as well. So everything has this kind of long process, and it's very labor intensive. So the tumbleweed pieces you see in the back, if we're talking about labor, they're kind of based in, kind of foraging and collecting, and kind of like a human heritage of repurposing materials. And I find that to be more and more important these days, because we have so many things that we have to deal with, like physical things that we are creating, and the waste and the consumerism. And so for me to take something that's considered a nuisance and make it a piece of art and put it in a gallery, I think is significant. And there's a kind of a moral behind it, kind of a redemptive process of something that is noxious, a noxious weed. And so that's what the tumbleweed is, and I have to collect it and process it, which means cutting it up, and it basically turns into a linear medium for me to kind of weave with, in a sense. Similar with sticks, when I see natural materials, I look at something that, it's almost like an artistic material that's given to you to play with. So it just reminds me of your childhood, your first encounter with a stick, whether it's a sword or a wand or, you know, a magic, anything, you know. So it kind of stems from that like childlike creativity that I think we all have. Some of us anyway, maybe Eastern Washington, they're tumbleweeds, they never considered that, but I grew up in Western Washington where there's just trees everywhere, and so the forest was my playground. And I think that you can kind of see that in my show a little bit. I did my undergrad at Central Washington University in Ellensburg. I actually completed my associates at Tacoma Community College, because after I quit volleyball, I just kind of had a scattering of credits that I kind of needed to focus. And so I got my associates and transferred to Central Washington University. And I just went directly into the art program. So I didn't have to take anything else and just focus solely on art. And when I was there, I was basically kind of catching up on a decade of not working in art materials. So like some of those were my first art classes. And I was inspired mainly when I got into sculpture and I saw Andy Goldsworthy's work. He's a British sculptor and he uses natural materials and he does work on site and just photographs it, so not many people see his work, but it's ephemeral and it deteriorates with the land. And then also Patrick Doherty's another artist that I look at, and he weaves with willow sticks. And so I got really excited when I thought about using a material that was already present. And that's when I was there, I started working with tumbleweed because it was kind of a foreign material to me growing up in Western Washington. So everybody had this idea about tumbleweed, like it was a nuisance. And I was like, what is this thing? It's very strange, you know? I definitely hit massive mounds of tumbleweed with my car on the freeway, traveling back and forth from home. And and so I just am inspired by materials that we don't usually typically see as artistic. So I get a lot of questions about that. First of all, people think it's a fabric or something like that. If you're not familiar with tumbleweed, you may have no clue what it is, but I harvest it from many different places. So since we're in Pocatello, Idaho, southeastern Idaho, I've gone to Atomic City, which is interesting, to go collect tumbleweed from there. And then there's some hot spots in town that I don't tell people about in case they want to get in on the tumbleweed game. You know, I'm trying to keep that my secret stash. But I collect it with there's different colors, like depending on when you collect it, you can get it dark, you can find pink and purple, and so definitely that's part of the process is collecting it, finding those colors and separating them out. So it's just all part of the process. And I also have an interest in psychology and how our mind works, and that's a little bit about what this show is about. You'll see a lot of imagery that looks like neurons or blood vessels, things that might be considered biomorphic, where you can't tell if it's like a living organism, a plant organism, or something from a human body. The whole show is meant to be an installation of sorts. Each individual piece, I don't think they would do as well on their own, especially with the stuff that looks like a grid or tile work. The pieces by themselves, they might be interesting, but definitely as a group, I think that they work better. And I'm also kind of talking about there's this variety in organisms, but also a major unifying factor, and so that's kind of what I'm talking about. And so everything's going to kind of have a nature base to it, and this is considered an installation as well. I'm thinking about rhizomes here and kind of pulling ideas from Gilles Deleuze. He was a philosopher in the 70s, and he talked about the rhizomatic theory, and it's becoming more and more prominent in different circles, especially in education. And very interesting ideas, but I guess the best way to describe it is kind of a fluid thinking, but also allowing for fluid thinking in an academic setting rather than this kind of linear or binary approach to information or ideas. And I think that as we're kind of challenging our Western culture right now, I think an expanded form of thinking is needed. And so that's kind of what my work is about too. I'm touching on the rhizomatic theory and how it might be pertinent at this time. We could talk about the tumbleweed pieces, I think it took me about 2 weeks per piece to forage material, process it, and then install, and you could consider that an 8-hour workday. Probably no more than 2 weeks for each one of those. And then something like this happens pretty quickly. I had a partner who helped me do this, and it probably took 2 days to get this installed. And what we did to kind of make it look like a cohesive unit was to peel the bark off of other areas and put it back on where there's joints so that you couldn't see where we made connections, because it's supposed to be kind of a fluid looking stick structure that's actually not in nature. Maybe under our feet, roots may look like this, but as far as a rhizome up on eye level, we're not used to seeing a structure like this. And so we use the bark to kind of obscure any contact points that look unnatural. So about 2 days, 2.5 days for that. Favorite medium? I really like it's an impulse to work with my hands. Like I always have to be doing something. I can never just sit and watch a movie. I always have to be messing with something. And so I think anything that I can build or sculpt or create in 3 dimensions is always the most satisfying for me. What I find whenever I'm working on a 2-dimensional surface, I'm always trying to create space in it. So I'm basically like a angsty painter that wants to sculpt, if I'm not sculpting. But sometimes when you sculpt, you really have to understand you're putting something into the world that is cumbersome and you're going to have to navigate around and protect. And so having materials that are going to go back to the earth in sculpture is very interesting to me, because I can kind of rest easy knowing that I'm not adding this enormous bronze statue that the next generations are going to have to deal with for thousands of years. And so I think using natural material and the fact that it does go back to the earth is kind of also another way that we could approach artwork as not this precious, eternal, untouchable thing, but as something that we can play with and that we can enjoy for a time. And that almost makes it more special. That's what the installation is, that you might be making something in a studio and you have an idea, and once you get in the space, it doesn't work, or you just don't know how it's going to work, and so you get a week to set up, and so you cross your fingers and hope that it actually is going to have an impact. And luckily, I feel like I was successful in this space with the time I had, because we don't get the gallery to test our work in, so they give you the space and they say, go ahead, and you make it work with what ideas you have. And that's kind of the kind of artist I am. I am definitely process oriented and like a creative problem solver. This show is going to be up in the Davis Gallery throughout the summer. But after this show comes down, I'll be selling the 12-inch pieces and the eco prints if people are interested. I'm going to be putting up a website, but I'm also going to have a show in Moses Lake, and many of the items are going to be sold from there, and it's called Basalt Gallery. There will be a website where people can access images of the work that's going to be sold there. The tumbleweed pieces, I don't know if they're going to make it to Moses Lake, but there may be some smaller pieces if anyone's interested in tumbleweed. Not a lot of people can house a 4.5-foot piece of artwork, but if you're interested, you could definitely contact me directly too. So what's happening for me next? I'm going to be teaching at Idaho State in the fall, maybe covering some 2D courses for a tenure professor who's going to leave. And in the meantime, I'm going to be getting a website up for myself and kind of connecting on social media and getting my work out there and looking for some spaces to do some shows. Also, I have a vision for doing installations like this, but expanded versions of them, and then adding a little bit more detail with some tumbleweed and some ceramic pieces. So kind of creating a 3-dimensional version of my paintings. So kind of bringing those to life completely, I think, is my next goal with this sort of work. I'm going to continue to work with tumbleweed on a smaller scale, just because lacking in studio space. I plan to continue to work in the future on my artwork and probably look for a job at a university. for the long term. I think that artists shouldn't take that for granted to have an audience, because we wouldn't be artists if we didn't have an audience. So if anyone cares to enjoy it or, you know, to experience artwork anymore, I think that we should celebrate that. So it's about the viewer. Yeah. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't have viewers.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Rachelle. I know I did, and I always love learning about other artists' processes and what inspires them, and this definitely uplifted me. If you liked this interview, give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see more of my content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I hope to do more of these artist interviews periodically. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you next time.